I'm just going to talk again about some other high-level kind of ideas that we want to capitalize on when we're talking about supporting second language learners, both typically developing and at risk. So one idea is the idea that wherever possible, we want to integrate content and language competency development, and I'm going to talk about that more in detail in just a moment. If possible, we want to make sure that we have massed as opposed to distributed practice. So a high concentration of instruction in a language. Research tells us that that's a positive thing in terms of the development of language proficiency. We want to make sure that we have high expectations of students, even if they are performing a task in their second language where they may have limited grammatical and vocabulary development. We want to make sure that we're expecting them to achieve, and this is particularly true for the students at risk. We want to make sure that we have appropriate expectations for them, but that we are expecting that they can make achievements in their second language. We want to check frequently for understanding. Again, a lot of these are principles that will be very familiar to you as the skilled ESL teachers that we know that you are. So the takeaway here, if you just look down to the bottom of this slide, is that, as I said earlier, the teaching strategies that are recommended for students with special education needs are generally really highly compatible with teaching practices that support second language learning. So the good news is that you don't necessarily have to do anything different. You maybe just need to think a little bit differently about how you target an activity to the needs of a specific student. So a lot of what Caroline and I talk about when we do workshops like this is the idea that it's not really useful to say, oh, this student in my class has trouble reading. Well, what are they having trouble with? Are they having trouble with phonological processing? Well, even in the second language, then they're going to need additional support in that area. But maybe they're really skilled when it comes to oral language. And so you don't need to spend as much time supporting that student in that area. So where possible, we really want to make sure that we're always targeting instruction to the specific needs of the student. We want to look for mismatches when we're not doing that. There are also some areas of difficulty that we know are particularly difficult for second language learners. So the idea that sometimes similar words are friends across two languages, like dance and danse, and sometimes they're not. So they're false friends, like bless in English and bless in French. And we all fall into this trap sometimes as second language users, where we think that maybe a word sounds the same and has the same meaning, and they don't always. So we also want to draw attention to figurative language, so expressions that are not common across English and French. So avoir un chat dans la gorge, it was new to me as a native speaker of English. A frog in your throat, it's a different animal, right? So you need to know what that means. We need to unpack these expressions so that when students hear them or read them, they can do something useful with them. We want to draw attention to words that have multiple meanings, both within languages and across languages. And we want to make sure specifically that we focus in on words that signal a transition, or really academic vocabulary words that are specific to school context. So how often in your life, when you don't say, can we compare and contrast, these two ways of getting our tires changed? No. But at school, we use expressions like compare and contrast a lot. And so we want to make sure that students, second language learners of a language, are familiar with those expressions so they can succeed in formal assessment situations as well. So we really want to make sure that we highlight that academic vocabulary use. Again, probably not a new concept for many of you. Okay. So the last thing I'm just going to touch on, and then I'll just move to our summary slide, is the idea that where possible, we want to integrate content and language learning. And so CLIL is just one model of how to do this. But we wanted to just talk a little bit about the idea that in order for a model like this to be successful, you as teachers have to have time to plan with other teachers who are working in the same cycle as you, so that you can really marry these content competencies and these language competencies. So to give you, we have an example on the next slide, which is a little hard to see on VIA, but will be easier to see when you have the slides and you can zoom in a bit. But essentially, this is a template that you might use to plan a unit about renewable sources of energy that sets competency goals both for ideas and concepts connected to science, but also with respect to language. So the idea that if you're going to be discussing renewable sources of energy, you might need to use expressions such as X causes Y, and so you want to make sure that you're talking about those linguistic structures as well, and that those language goals are as important as the content-related goals. And so in order to do this, it might mean pairing with a teacher from a different content area, but that if we can create these types of situations, that's going to be more rich for students, and it's an important way for students to learn to meet their linguistic goals in conjunction with content area goals. So we had some questions just for you to reflect on later, but how often are you already doing this? A lot of you probably are doing things like this already because the ESL curriculum really lends itself well to doing that, but you might want to take a little inventory for yourself of how often you do that, and also think a little bit about how you might plan a similar unit, or if that's less relevant to you, you might also want to think about some obstacles and barriers that prevent you from doing this more and how you might be able to remove them. So do you need more time? Do you need more resources? What do you need kind of with respect to that?